Hello, welcome everybody. Welcome to the video podcast. In this video podcast, we will be talking about the superolateral view of the cerebral cortex. We'll talk about the different sulci and the gyri on the superolateral surface. Remember, sulcus is the depression, and the gyri are the elevation between two corresponding sulci, and our entire cerebral cortex is folded into the tight confines of the cranial cavity, and because of that folding, we see these elevations and depressions, the gyri and the sulci, respectively. Now, as usual, the first step is to orientate the prosection or the picture of the prosection. So if you look over here, we're looking at the superolateral view of cerebral cortex. We can see some important sulci over here, such as the lateral sulcus here. So we can therefore appreciate the lobe beneath the lateral sulcus would be the temporal lobe, and above it over here would be the frontal and parietal lobe somewhere over here. Now, then we can see a long sulcus here, which is the central sulcus separating the frontal and parietal lobes from each other. Frontal in the front, parietal at the back, and the separation between them is the central sulcus. This is the front end over here, so that'll be the frontal lobe, and this is the posterior side of the brain. And it's the location of the cerebellum kind of gives you a clue as well. That this is the back end of the brain. So this would be our occipital lobe, or the occipital part of the cerebral cortex. The same orientation applies over here as well. This is a similar superolateral view of cerebral cortex, but from a different brain. Right. Now that we've got the orientation sorted, we let's just mark out let's identify and mark out the boundaries of the four lobes very quickly. So we can see all four lobes over here, as we just mentioned already. Central sulcus is separating the frontal and parietal lobes from each other. Lateral sulcus is separating the temporal lobe down below from frontal and parietal lobes at the top. And there's another sulcus at the back, which you can actually appreciate in its entirety on the medial surface when we look at the inner surface of the brain. But here we're looking at the superolateral surface, but we can still appreciate a little indentation over here. This is basically the parieto-occipital sulcus, or whatever part of the parieto-occipital sulcus, which we can see here. It's mainly on the medial surface side. If we connect this little indentation all the way down over here to this indentation here, this little angle which is on the inferior surface of the brain, this is known as the preoccipital notch. And if we join these two together, then more or less this is the region behind this line called the occipital lobe. uh, Although the demarcation might not be really that sharp when we talk about the different lobes, but this is just for our orientation purposes. So, anyways, now let's take up the lobes one by one and see which parts of the lobes, which sulci and gyri within each lobe can we see in the superolateral view of cerebral cortex. Right, so let's take up the frontal lobe first. The frontal lobe basically extends all the way from the central sulcus all the way anteriorly till over here, and it is above the temporal lobe, where it is separated by a lateral sulcus. So it's kind of bounded by the lateral sulcus and by the central sulcus over here. Uh, this is our frontal lobe. Now, the frontal lobe is uh, on at least on its superolateral view is divided by three sulci into four gyri. And remember, sulci are the depression, gyri are the elevations. Now, let me just explain these sulci, three sulci, and the four gyri. So if you look over here, we already have talked about a sulcus called the central sulcus, which was extending all the way from the superior margin and down all the way almost to the lateral sulcus. Right parallel to the central sulcus and anterior to it is another sulcus, which is called as the precentral sulcus. Has almost the same length as the central sulcus, extends all the way on the surface of the cortex, on superolateral surface. And remember, as I think I mentioned this in one of my previous podcasts as well, that don't expect the sulci to be one continuous entity. There could be some interruptions here and there, but more or less you can see a continuous sulcus anterior to the central sulcus. This would be our precentral sulcus. Don't be bothered by these interruptions by some by the gyri in between. This is our precentral sulcus, and the area between the precentral sulcus in the front and the central sulcus at the back. This is the precentral gyrus. Remember, the gyrus is the elevation between two corresponding sulci, between two successive sulci. So precentral gyrus lies between the central sulcus at the back and precentral sulcus in the front. Precentral gyrus is part of the frontal lobe, and frontal lobe is motor. So this is our primary motor area. So all the motor commands, once they get finalized, they're planned, they are sent to the precentral gyrus, to the primary motor area, from where these are then transmitted down to the effector organs through different tracts. For instance, the effector organs could be the skeletal muscles, the tract could be the corticospinal tract. But this all the motor commands, once finalized, they are executed from over here, from the primary motor area. So this is our first precentral gyrus. Then if you look in front of the precentral sulcus, this entire region, this more or less belongs to the prefrontal cortex, and this is our more advanced part of the frontal lobe, concerned with the motor planning and some abstract functions of our personality, such as judgmental thinking, abstract thinking, those kinds of higher order cortical functions. Now here we can actually see two sulci. Those would be the superior frontal sulcus, which I'm kind of trying to mark out over here. That's the superior frontal sulcus, and we've got another sulcus called the inferior frontal sulcus, which is more or less over here. And consequently, we've got three gyri: the superior frontal gyrus above the superior frontal sulcus. Then we've got the middle frontal gyrus between the superior frontal sulcus and the middle frontal sulcus. And then beneath that, we've got the inferior frontal gyrus, this entire region over here. The sulci might not be that clearly visible over here, but we can still mark out their continuity over here and over here. The superior one here, the inferior one here, and consequently three gyri. The inferior frontal gyrus can be seen further being split up or being invaded by the rami of the lateral sulcus. Remember, in a previous video podcast, we talked about the lateral sulcus, the stem of lateral sulcus, and that splits up into a posterior ramus, which is the main continuation of the lateral sulcus, and then it had an anterior ascending ramus and an anterior horizontal ramus. And those two rami are kind of invading into the inferior frontal gyrus, consequently forming some other subgyri. For example, this region here, this is known as pars orbitalis, which is underneath the anterior horizontal ramus of lateral sulcus, and then between the anterior horizontal ramus and the anterior ascending ramus, this triangular region is pars triangularis, and then behind it, this part belongs to pars opercularis, which spans over the frontal as well as the parietal lobe at the back. Right, so now let's take up the next lobe, which is the parietal lobe, right? The parietal lobe is bounded between the central sulcus in the front and the lateral sulcus down below. While if you go all the way to the back, remember we talked about a sulcus called parieto-occipital sulcus, and we could only see a little part of it. The parieto-occipital sulcus is going to separate the parietal lobe at the back from the occipital lobe. So these would be the extents of the parietal lobe. Parietal lobe is mainly sensory in function. Now here we've got two sulci which split up the lobe into three gyri. So let's talk about those sulci, the depressions, and the gyri, the elevations. We already know about the location of the central sulcus, and right behind it and kind of parallel to it all along the length of the central sulcus is this sulcus called the post-central sulcus. Just like we had a pre-central sulcus in the front, we have a post-central sulcus at the back. And the region between the post-central sulcus here, this region over here between the post-central sulcus and the central sulcus, this entire region, this is a gyrus known as the post-central gyrus. This is the primary sensory area. So all the sensory information the all the sensory information such as of touch, vibration, proprioception, 2 point discrimination, all of them are gonna they're gonna come into the cortex primarily being perceived over here, and then they're gonna be thrown over to the secondary association areas and higher order tertiary association areas to make sense out of those things. But the primary sensory area is right over here. Then behind that, the primary sensory area, we've got another sulcus here, kind of perpendicular to the post-central sulcus. This is the intraparietal sulcus, which splits up the parietal lobe into a superior parietal lobe or gyrus here, and an inferior parietal lobule or the gyrus over here. So this is our superior parietal gyrus. This is inferior parietal gyrus, separated by the intraparietal sulcus. And post-central gyrus is in between the post-central sulcus and the central sulcus. Right. Now let's jump over to the temporal lobe, which is lying underneath the lateral sulcus. The temporal lobe is characterized by two sulci. There are two sulci over here which split it up into three gyri. We can see right underneath the lateral sulcus and more or less parallel to it is this sulcus, which is the superior temporal sulcus, and and then underneath it, this one might not be that clear, but there's another sulcus underneath it, partly here and then partly over here. This is the middle temporal sulcus, and consequently we've got three gyri: the superior temporal gyrus, the middle temporal gyrus, and the inferior temporal gyrus. The superior temporal gyrus is in between the lateral sulcus and the superior temporal sulcus, and then the middle temporal gyrus that lies between the superior temporal sulcus and the middle temporal sulcus. For some reason, it's called middle temporal sulcus. Well, in fact, we've got only two sulci, so this could have been actually called the inferior temporal sulcus. But there is no inferior temporal sulcus. There is a superior temporal sulcus, and there is a middle temporal sulcus, and consequently, we've got superior temporal gyrus, a middle temporal gyrus, and an inferior temporal gyrus, which then continues onto the inferior surface of the cerebral hemisphere. And we'll talk about that in some later video podcast. Lastly, at the back, we've got the occipital lobe, and the occipital lobe is the one which is mainly concerned with the vision. And we know that the parieto-occipital sulcus, partly visible here, that marks out the boundary between the occipital lobe at the back and the parietal and the temporal lobes in the front. So, to summarize, we marked out the boundaries of the four different lobes on the superolateral surface of the cerebral cortex, and then we talked about one by one about the important sulci, the depressions and elevations, the gyri on the visible on the cortex in its superolateral